Today on The Game Adventure, we are talking the massive backlash around NVIDIA's attempt to regenerate graphics with generative AI, the end of the PlayStation Network, and why community and not graphics is what drives great games. Let's go. The Game Adventure podcast is a weekly, family-friendly show keeping you up to date on all the latest news in video games. We'll also mix in a heavy dose of nostalgia with retro games and even things like how the worlds of tech and culture and even faith interact with video games as an art form. We're doing it all in less than an hour every Saturday morning, so let's get started. What is up, everybody? It is so good to be with you again on another Saturday morning. This is Dan. I am your host for The Game Adventure, and we have got a lot of news to get through today. Man, it has been a crazy week this week. I've kind of been peeking at the news over the course of the week, watching articles roll in, watching the saga of NVIDIA unfold with their generative AI being used in video games. Man, some really wild stuff happening this week, and so I'm excited to get into it with you. Let's go ahead and jump in with some industry news. So if you are a fan of the game Subnautica, and we're very much looking forward to the sequel to that game, Subnautica 2, this piece of news is right up your alley, and frankly, it's kind of a bummer. So basically what happened is the agreement that the publisher of this game, Krafton, had with the development team was to pay out a hefty sum of a performance bonus if they met certain metrics. And so basically what happened is the publisher decided to be sneaky and basically let go the CEO before that could be paid out, basically as a way of getting out of paying that $250 million performance bonus. And he took it to court and he actually won. So the resolution was the judge basically handed control of the early access launch back to the creators, basically saw through the publisher's legal maneuvering. And so now Subnautica 2 is back on track for an early access release in May of this year. And the publisher has a certain amount of time extended to figure out how to pay out this bonus amount. So I think really this is a win. This is one of those like industry type stories that's just like gross, you know? This is not the kind of thing that we want to hear about. We want to hear about the creators of these games, when they do excellent work, being rewarded for that so that they can continue to take risks on different kinds of games. Like Subnautica is kind of a weird, different game, but it really struck a chord with a lot of people. So this is definitely a situation that is a win for the industry because the people who are actually working on the games are being compensated and being given the kind of capital that's going to let them continue to make games. And so I love that. The next story is also kind of a downer. Honestly, it was kind of a downer week as far as like industry news is concerned. Ubisoft did shutter game development at their historic studio that Tom Clancy actually founded. So if you're a fan of the Splinter Cell games, the Tom Clancy games, it resulted in like 105 layoffs, and the studio will remain open pretty much just for back-end engine support. And so this was really what this studio had been working on was a lot of VR type of stuff. And so I think this is, on one hand, definitely kind of the depressing industry-wide thing that we're seeing where Western studios are shrinking, trying to figure out how do we do what we're doing. And then you've got, publishers trying to hold on to millions and millions of dollars, which makes it hard for the game creators to actually continue doing what they do best. And so the other side of this, though, is that this was largely a studio that was working in the VR space. And I think VR still feels pretty novelty, to me at least. It doesn't really feel like the next frontier. Honestly, it feels a lot like kind of where 3D TVs were back about 15 or 20 years ago, where they were just starting to come out and you had to wear the glasses for them. You had to sit in just the right spot. And it was like, yeah, I don't know if this is going to be a mass adoption kind of thing. And sure enough, they really didn't catch on in living rooms. And I think we're kind of seeing the same struggle with VR, trying to figure out, does the technology exist quite yet that's going to make this functional for the average person. And I want to believe that there's probably technology coming down the line that's going to allow that to happen. But right at this moment in time, it seems like VR is not producing the revenue and the large number of people actually getting on board, adoption of the consumer base that's actually going to allow it to thrive. And I think this studio, who is largely at this point focused on VR, is a good indicator of that as well. Sony is dropping the PlayStation Network branding, which is kind of they're calling it a strategic phase out. They're going to just stop using the terms PSN or PlayStation Network by fall of this year. Their core multiplayer services and trophy features are going to stay unaffected. So the game community really isn't losing a lot here, other than maybe a little bit of nostalgia. I think that you can kind of look at this one of two ways. Either it's just we're moving on to do something that is more integrated with the whole experience of the PlayStation brand. And so we just don't need these terms PlayStation Network because it's not like a separate thing. Like when you're a part of the PlayStation brand, you're already on the network. You're part of the community. And so we don't need a different term for this, the same way that we don't really talk about like Xbox Live as like a service, the same way that we did once upon a time. It's just part of the experience of booting up your PlayStation. You're there, you're online. So I think that's maybe part of it. The other piece maybe though is a little bit of historical context. If you remember back to 2011, PlayStation Network went down for like 24 days because of a data breach, basically an attack on their service that ended up not only taking the service down for like over 3 weeks, but also compromised the data of like 77 million accounts. And so I just wonder if perhaps this is some kind of hope by PlayStation to bury the ghost of 2011 and maybe just kind of shift toward a new Sony account kind of thing in their existing ecosystem. Those are the main stories for the industry kind of side of things. Let's take a look at the tech side of things. Some absolutely wild things happening in the technology area this week. And the main thing was around DLSS 5 and this idea of generative lighting technology. So here's the basics of what this is. NVIDIA announced DLSS 5, which basically moves. DLSS 4 was really about upscaling and upconverting things frame by frame to kind of make things look better than they did. It's about sharpening things, making them look better. And DLSS 5 is shifting from frame generation, so kind of putting frames in addition to what was there, and it's actually using generative AI that completely re-renders the photoreal lighting and materials. And so the demo required a dual high-end RTX 5090 graphic card to even run. So this is like pretty much the bleeding edge. It's taken some beefy stuff to actually pull this off. But what happened is the response to this was like whiplash going back and forth. So the initial response to it was somewhat positive. You actually had the guys at Digital Foundry talking about this. They covered it initially and had a pretty positive reaction. They said, this is cool tech. It's unlike anything that we've seen. I think it's the way that a lot of us felt initially about things like ChatGPT and Sora and the ability to generate video using AI and photos using AI. We're like, whoa, that's unlike anything I've ever seen before. And so we have this kind of, this is cool reaction, like strictly to the technology. But as people often do, we kind of have a delayed response where we start to think about, wait, what does this mean? What does this mean for us? What does this mean for the artists? So like the artists that are making these video games clearly have a vision behind this, and they put a lot of time and effort into pulling something off to make it look a certain way. And to have it then kind of like re-rendered and laid over the top of it to make it better according to what the AI thinks it should look like, maybe that's not something that I'm such a big fan of. And so I spent a decent amount of time looking at the photos. Some of the photos that came out of this are like really kind of wild because it does look almost photoreal. But the question is, does it really look like what the artist had intended this game to look like? The vibe, the feel overall, like was hyperrealism really what we were going for here or not? And so there was kind of this backlash to it. And then NVIDIA came back and said, the CEO said, no. The developers are actually going to love the efficiency of this, and artists are actually going to love this as well, because they're going to have a lot of control over how it actually gets used. Maybe that's the case. However, I have seen a number of artists that have worked on video games that have said, we definitively do not love this. We don't love the idea of generative art, if you want to call it art. I don't believe it's art. Using generative stuff to put over the top of what I have already said is my finished work. Can you imagine? Like, I think about, I'm an artist as well. I do a lot of like ink drawing and stuff like that. I'm also a musician, so I like record music. Can you imagine if I put out a song and I said, here it is. I spent a ton of time like mastering that and getting it to sound exactly like it does in my head. I hope you enjoy it. And somebody took that song and said, yeah, I'm actually going to add a couple of instruments that you forgot to add. I didn't forget to add any instruments. This is the way that I wanted it to sound. And so the artists feel very much the same way. That's the way I wanted it to look. If I wanted it to look different from this, I would have done so. So it's hard to tell where this is going to go. I suspect that people will start to warm to the idea when they turn it down a little bit. Usually, like when you're applying certain special effects, especially in audio production, the tendency is to go too high at first. Like you turn up the reverb way high and you're like, oh, that sounds like a cathedral. It sounds so great. And then you realize, oh, this is too much. I can't hear the detail. Something got lost in the mix. And so you turn it down. So I suspect that's what will happen is we'll still see this implemented in future games, but it might be implemented a little less obviously than it was in this case. What's interesting, though, is they're not the only name in the game here. You've also got AMD with Microsoft working on FSR Next, which is like their version of it, slightly different. We won't go into the details today. But then Sony is doing something altogether different with PSSR 2. And it's kind of just using hardware to see how can we make this look the best that it possibly can with what exists. So some really widely different approaches to how do we improve graphics and what's the role of AI and generative technology in computer graphics. That remains to be seen. The next story is that Project Helix, we kind of talked a little bit about how that's going to blend Windows and Xbox, and that's the goal. That's really all the details we have right now, other than they're going to start getting some alpha kits out in 2027 to developers to start playing with the hardware itself. And another thing we see happening like next month is that Xbox mode is being released for Windows 11 PCs so that it's like a full screen Xbox mode, which further, even today, blends the next generation and this generation at the same time, which is really wild. So it's kind of interesting that we see this convergence that's happening, not in like the next system is going to be totally it, and there it's all mixed. It's kind of happening over the course of time where your PC becomes a console. And by the time Helix actually rolls around, whatever that ends up being called, nobody knows what it's going to be called. Is it the Duo? I've heard the Fusion. And I think the Helix is awesome. But if we stuck with the code name, we would have had, instead of the GameCube, we would have had the Nintendo Dolphin, which I think would have been a great name for a console, but maybe that's just me. But what's weird is we're not seeing like a generation leap to the next generation of hardware. It's like going to happen first via software. So by the time Helix rolls around, we might actually be pretty used to the idea because we've kind of seen it happening with our Windows PCs already. And you could make the argument that this actually started quite a while ago when you could start streaming games to your computer when Xbox started to say anything can be an Xbox, which they've kind of rolled back, but the technology is there now, and it's still available. So anyway, the next thing is the Nintendo Switch has got some updates over the course of the last week. We'll say one update has come and the other has been promised, but maybe not for us in America quite yet. So on the software side, we have the handheld boost mode that allows the Switch 2 to play Switch 1 games, some Switch 1 games, at docked resolutions. Basically, the Switch was able to play things at 1080 on the screen, and it played them at 720p on the screen of the device itself in handheld mode. And what this allows you to do with the Switch 2, because the Switch 2 is a little more beefy, it's a lot more beefy. It's a lot of beef. It's a really great system. I love the Switch 2. It is very powerful. And so you can play your Switch 1 games in 1080, taking advantage of that beautiful screen on the Switch 2. It's just a little bit bigger and a little sharper. I don't know how big of a deal this is. Personally, the bigger deal for me, if I'm going to play something in handheld mode, is that it's going to last a long time. And so give me more play time. And to do that, if you need to knock it down to 720 on this relatively small screen, I'm actually okay with that. I would rather be able to play Zelda for an extra hour at 720 than to have it at 1080 for an hour less time, especially if I'm traveling. I don't have access to a charger. So that's my personal preference, but maybe that's not who this is for. Maybe this is for the people who are not playing on a big screen regularly, which is usually how I play my Switch 2. Maybe this is for the folks who want to play in high def just right there on their Switch 2. For them, this is awesome. The second change is coming potentially to hardware. So there was a law that was passed in the EU which required by 2027 manufacturers of portable electronic devices to have a user replaceable battery. So they said, if you're going to sell this here, you have to let consumers be able to replace the battery easily without specialized tools. And so the Switch 2s that they will be selling in Europe by 2027 will have a removable battery. So that you can actually replace the battery, which we all know is usually the first thing to go in a handheld console like the Switch 2. So I think that's cool. Me personally, I wish that the legal side didn't have to happen. You shouldn't have to force a company to do this. But as a consumer, I think that's actually cool. I would actually encourage Nintendo. Yes, this is a great idea. Me, the consumer, I love this idea, and I will pay for the ability to replace the battery down the road. The last thing for the tech kind of side of news is the Xbox changes that have been made. One of the things is they have Xbox insiders in particular are able to disable the quick resume on individual games, which is a big deal for games that are constantly connected to the server. This was highly requested by the community, and so it's pretty cool that that's actually coming to the Xbox. It's one of those small quality of life improvements that I think actually makes more of a difference for those of us who are booting up a game for an hour every night and don't have to worry about shutting it all down and turning it all back on again just because the Xbox was trying to be helpful, and it wasn't. So with that, let's move on to the point of view segment, and I want to share something I've been thinking about for a little while with you. So the big idea here is that the real magic of gaming isn't about the most powerful hardware, the most polished graphics, the most expensive game to manufacture. It's actually really about the community that you are forming with that game. And I think a lot of what's been happening in modern gaming is it strips away this human connection by trying to solve for that problem by giving us other things instead of the human connection that we really want. So this kind of played out through a lot of the stories this week. I was really surprised to kind of see how many connections there were to this. So maybe I'm onto something here. One of the first stories that I saw was this Maniac Mansion game that was a big deal. It's from LucasArts. It was really, really popular back in the day. It was pretty difficult. And there was this group that did this. They called it an adventure game aptitude test. And AGAT. AGAT, the worst acronym ever. Okay, maybe not ever, but it's pretty bad. And basically, they had these people come in and they said, we're going to have 800 plus entrants. And you had to have specifically like, it was a proctored type of experience, which means they used university software to watch you play the game through your computer to make sure that you are not using any type of like tips and tricks, sheets, guides, anything like that. You don't have another window open on your computer to check what's actually like guides, help of any kind. You're not talking to somebody else. And what happened is only 2 people out of this entire group actually beat the game within the 4 hours that they gave them. And part of this for me, it sounds awful, honestly. Part of this for me makes me wonder if they kind of have entirely missed the point of video games. I think they were trying to show that video games were harder back in the day, or that there was something different in character about these like 80s and early 90s video games. And there certainly was. But we didn't beat old games because we were especially good at them or because we were like elite video game players. We haven't really gotten worse at video games over time. We beat them because of the community that developed around them. Think about this with me. Think about the games that you couldn't beat on the first go, and usually it was the only game that you had to play at that point in time. There was no Game Pass. There was no like limitless number of video games that you could just flip to and go change and play something different. This was the game that you had, and you were going to figure it out, by golly. And when you couldn't figure it out, where did you go? Well, you couldn't go to the internet necessarily because maybe you could scroll some message boards after a certain point in time. But initially, you went to the playground. You went to talk to your friends. You called up your friend on the phone, like a landline phone. You said, hey, have you got to this spot yet? What did you do? How did you get past that? How did you get the chest opened, right? Like, there was a community that was built around this. You would talk to a kid on a playground who, oh yeah, my friend knows a kid at another school who beat that section by doing this, or solved the puzzle by doing this, or I sat up for 8 hours yesterday and I played this game and I figured out how to beat it. This is what you do. So there was like a community around it. And when you take away the community, the game isn't just challenging, it's miserable. Because it was never meant to be played in isolation like that. Another place that we used to go was the game stores. And so you would have like the GameStop and the sometimes Best Buy, where you would have like a dedicated gaming employee. And you would talk to that person. You'd be excited about the game you were getting because they had played it and you were going to play it. You would even go back and you talk to them about how much fun it was, and they'd point you towards your next favorite game that you were going to have based on their recommendation. And so there was even this like community built around it. And kind of a fun story from this last week was GameStop classified the PS3, the Xbox 360, and the Wii U as retro. And honestly, that hurts just a little bit because it makes me feel old. But when I started to think about what makes those systems or made them great, it was really the community that developed around them. Like you think about Halo. What made Halo so great? It was a great game. And yeah, you would go home and you would play it by yourself sometimes. Like you would go home, you'd play that campaign. I remember kids taking off school to go home when Halo 2 came out to play through the campaign. But what made it so great was you would come back and you talk to your friends about what you did and what you saw and what you experienced. And then, I mean, not to speak of the LAN parties where you get together and play multiplayer in a room surrounded by some of your best friends. Those are some of my best memories from being a kid was, man, playing with my friends and the community that developed around that. And then there was this other cool story that was the Pokemon story about the cable that connects the Game Boy. So the link cable was a failed accessory at first because they thought people would just want to trade their game data. But what they didn't bet on was that it would be used for an even greater type of connection where you were trading characters in the game, which is what the creator of Pokemon actually got this idea from. He said, wouldn't it be cool if you had actual creatures that were being traded between devices, between games? And hence the idea of trading pocket monsters. Pokemon came from this little almost failed accessory that turned the Game Boy into one of the best-selling things around Pokemon Red, Blue, Yellow, and beyond, before there was wireless connections available. So you even think about like the idea of the achievement. And why do we want achievements? I love achievements on Xbox. That's the main reason I'm an Xbox fan. And if there is anybody from Nintendo who ever hears me talking on this podcast, let me just ask you kindly, please bring achievements to the Nintendo systems. Like, I want achievements on my Switch 2 so badly, and I know that it's not hard because there are guys who are working on putting achievements, retro achievements, bringing them to Wii games for emulated systems. Like, it can be done, and the one thing that I think makes that so cool and why people love achievements is it's something to share. It's something to show off. Look what I did. Look what I accomplished. And looking at my friends' achievements. Oh, look what they did. Look what they accomplished. Look what we have in common. So my final piece of this, lest I go on forever talking about community, which obviously is something I'm passionate about, which is why I'm doing this podcast in the first place. Because I value the community that happens around like-minded people, and video games is one of the places that tends to happen. I heard about Xbox testing out Copilot in the Xbox dashboard. So basically, they're doing tests to see how do people use Copilot as an AI available in the dashboard. And they thought that people would use them the way that people use AI chatbots now with video games, where, hey, let me go to Gemini or let me go to ChatGPT and type in, hey, I'm at this spot in the game. How do I beat this, right? They thought that people would use it as like a game guide. Hey, help me figure this out. How do I beat this boss? But how the majority of them have used it is actually just for conversation. They're chatting with the chatbot. Hey, they're saying things like, how was your day? How's life? Talking like they would talk to a friend on a couch. And to me, that exposes something really important, that we really desire friendships and community. So here's my question, I guess, is how do we foster relationships around video games? I don't think it happens on YouTube as easily as it should, even though there's a lot of gamers there, a lot of I have videos there. But by the time you sift through the chatbots and the trolls, you find the one or two people maybe that you can have a good conversation with, but that doesn't feel like a place where a couple people spend some time getting to know each other, talking, sharing a love of a shared game. So like, where's that happening? I'd be very curious to hear from you. Where is that kind of community happening for you around video games? And what are some ideas that you have for making that happen? So with that, let's jump into one of my favorite segments, the Retro Rewind. There was some really fun stuff happening this week around some PC ports and also some emulation stuff that was happening. A few of which I've kind of alluded to already. One is Transport Tycoon, if you remember that, from 1994, is now available on Steam for $9.99. I love, one of my favorite things about Steam is the way that I can still find those old PC games from when I was a kid that I can still play on Steam. That's one of my favorite parts about the Steam library, and one of the things that I love the most about what Xbox has chosen to do with backward compatibility and making original Xbox games and forward available. So many games that you can go back and play. Man, there's some real gems in there. And I don't know about Transport Tycoon, if that's a gem so much as like a nice hit of nostalgia, but it's cool that it's available. Another thing that has come to PC unofficially is the Animal Crossing game that was made for GameCube. So this has come to basically you have to have you don't have to have an emulator to run it the way you usually would, but you do have to have the ROM, which is the game file. You already have to have that either from the disk or however you have obtained that file. Hopefully you got it directly from the disk that you purchased back in the day. But if you didn't, we won't talk about that here. Basically, what this lets you do from a game preservation standpoint is it lets you run this directly on a computer. And I think that's really cool because this is a game that Nintendo doesn't support anymore. It just doesn't exist anywhere. But it is available now to play if you still have the disc or have that ROM file. Another cool thing I mentioned was Retro Achievements is finally coming to the Wii games. Their team has been working really hard on getting it to function on the Dolphin emulator. And I think March 19th, so just 2 days ago, that actually went live. So that's pretty awesome. Love Retro Achievements and the ability to play through those old games again and get achievements for them where they never existed before. Finally, we have some kind of sad news. So DuckStation is a really important emulator for PlayStation games. So if you don't have an original PlayStation and you're using ROMs to play your PlayStation games, DuckStation was a really big one, and they are officially ending support for Android. So if you are playing on an Android device, you're going to have to find another emulator. Basically, the emulation community is kind of lamenting the sheer amount of work that is required to maintain these apps. And the reason that they pulled the plug on this, they said, was toxic community harassment and corporate exploitation. So specifically, there was a group that was using their code for DuckStation in commercial products without actually giving them credit, which I do see kind of a sense of irony in, because you are creating a product that is meant to play games that perhaps people don't have the permission to own in the first place. So make what you want of that. It is disappointing, but there are a lot of other emulators that are available for PlayStation 1 in particular. So I'm sure another one will work for you if you're on Android. Let's go ahead from there and jump to the game list. A couple of big games have launched over the course of this last week. Well, the biggest one probably being Crimson Desert, which is available on PC, PS5, and Xbox. And this is a single-player game. It has sold tremendously well, basically 2 million copies in the first 24 hours. However, the results of the reviews are kind of mixed. So it has like a 78 Metacritic score the last time that I looked, which actually caused the publisher, Pearl Abyss, to take like a 30% stock plunge. I always find it interesting how quickly things in the industry respond to things like a Metacritic score, because the way you get to a 78 is by having a good number of people who liked it quite a bit and some people who really didn't like it. And so the main feeling of a lot of people is, first of all, from a technical side, it is very impressive how they have managed to pull off what they have with the existing technology. It's a technical masterpiece. It's like a really beautiful game. It looks very realistic. And so moving as many copies as they did is pretty impressive. However, the flip side of that is the reviews are suggesting that basically this is the cart has gone before the horse, with the cart being the visuals being fantastic, but the story itself is kind of hard to pick up what is actually the story that's going on here. People saying things like, I don't actually know what I'm supposed to be doing a lot of the time. Even the guys who are doing the professional reviews for these are like giving up. I'm partway finished with the review because it's such a big world that they're spending a lot of time trying to figure out where exactly am I supposed to go and what am I supposed to do. So perhaps they spent a mite too much time thinking about how visually attractive they could make the game without starting with the essentials, which we all know. I mean, as the podcast host for The Game Adventure, the adventure that you go on is highly reliant on the story itself. So you got to get the story right, or it can look as beautiful as it can, but it's not going to draw people in. I'm not going to stay just because the game is beautiful. And if you can hear Kevin snuffing and sneezing in the background, my dog, you can tell that he agrees with me. So there. Um, the next game is coming out shortly. This is Starfield. Again, is coming out on PlayStation 5. It's only going to be $50, so that's actually kind of nice. Looks like there's another game coming out a little later this year that I wanted to highlight called At Fate's End. This is coming to PC and consoles. It was highlighted by the ID at Xbox. And so it looks like it's fun because it's a side-scrolling action adventure. I love this kind of game. I'm so glad that people like Thunder Lotus are still making this style of game because, again, it doesn't have like most bleeding edge, biggest world, best graphics, but it has the potential to be so much fun and still tell a really great story. So if you remember, these are the guys that were behind the game Spiritfarer. And so they're kind of pivoting to this, what they call an emotional action adventure about family members who are dueling and fighting. And so, I don't know, this has the potential to be something really cool. I don't know if it's going to be something for kids necessarily, but definitely something to keep an eye out for. At Fate's End, late 2026 is what they're looking at there. The next game is one that we've talked about before, Pokemon Pokopia. This has done tremendously well, 2.2 million copies in just 4 days. And keep in mind, that is in 4 days on just the Switch 2. This is a Switch 2 exclusive game, and it moved that many copies. By comparison, I just said Crimson Desert moved 2 million copies in 24 hours, and that's impressive, but that's across PC, PS5, Xbox Series as well. And so Pokopia, man, this is just... it's amazing that it's done as well as it has. People are saying this is a lot of fun for kids. It's a great way to discover Pokemon in like a lot more chill environment. No battling, no dueling dynamics. It's like the slow life Pokemon game that I definitely, it is very high on my list of what to get next for my Switch 2. The final game I wanted to talk about is Donkey Kong Bonanza. And you're like, this game came out 9 months ago, July of last year. It was a 3D action platformer. They have an incredible amount of destructible things in the world, which is kind of what makes it cool. The reason I wanted to bring this one up, if you haven't played it yet, is that there's this cool thing happening with speedrunners and the developers. So speedrunners try to move through the game as fast as they possibly can. In the case of a game that has breakable stuff everywhere, they have a lot of fun by figuring out like, what can I break to break the game? Or, you know, how do I get from one area to the next in a way that the developers didn't anticipate to beat this game even faster? And what's happening is the developers at Nintendo are actively tracking and watching these speedrunners post their videos, and they're looking at how did you exploit the game. They're patching the game based on these like progression breaks, but they're also learning from how these guys are interacting with the game. And so what I think is really cool is that the developers are learning from the players, and the players are, whether they meant to or not, are showing the developers things about their game that the developers didn't know, or at least didn't see the first time around. So I love that there's this like synergy between the player and the developer with, I mean, who other than Nintendo is going to pay this close attention to their players? And so I just kind of love that, because that means gaming, and this, even a game that's 9 months old, is still like changing and growing. And the people who made it, a lot of the same team that made Mario Odyssey, are still learning from the people that are playing the game. And I just kind of love that. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this week's show. I do have a couple of things from last week's question. I asked, what are some great games that you play with your kids? And people did bring up like some of the old Nintendo Entertainment System games are simpler control-wise. And so that's true. There's a couple of those. Minecraft came up an awful lot. The Lego games came up as probably one of the best games to play with younger kids, because there's just fewer controls that you have to know. And because of the way that you can do it with somebody else, so like couch co-op for the Lego games is fantastic. It means that you can help your younger kid by reading everything out. And that actually brings me to one more thought around how do you deal with the amount of text that is in some of these games that are otherwise great for young kids? Do you just wait until they're old enough to read it, or do you read it out loud? I have a 12-year-old daughter who is awesome at reading everything out loud. So like if I'm playing with the kids and she's there, she'll just automatically read all of the words on the screen for me if I'm playing Zelda. But it does kind of beg the question with some of these younger games for younger kids, could we make them more accessible if we actually had those words read? How do you want to do that? I don't know, but I think that would be kind of cool to see, because a lot of these games that are great for younger kids otherwise are kind of have this barrier because they have a lot of text. So I guess teach your kids to read. That's the that's the takeaway here. The question for next week actually comes from one of my very good friends from high school. His name is Matt. He's actually a maker of video games as well, so I can't wait to get him on the show sometime in the future. His question was relating back to GameStop's announcement that the 360, the PS3, and the Wii U are now retro consoles. He said, it had me equal parts offended and nostalgic. What are some of your favorite games and memories from that era? It's a great question. From the Xbox 360, PS3, Wii U era, what are some of your favorite games from that era? And particularly, I'll add, what are some of the games from that era that maybe slipped under the radar for a lot of people? So like, yeah, everybody was playing Halo, everybody was playing the Mario games on the Wii U, but what are some games that you played that maybe slipped under the radar for the rest of us? I'd love to hear what you were playing during that era of your life and why, like why it's memorable for you. Some of my memories that come from games aren't just from the games themselves, but like what was happening in my life at that time that made that game special for me. So that's it for the Game Adventure this week. I look forward to getting together with you again next Saturday. I will see you right here. Have a great weekend.